Hello, class. Welcome to my favorite unit. I'm all dressed up for you and ready to present the Pride and Prejudice unit. This is one of my biggest passions, and I'm so excited to share it with you guys. So I decided to wear my Jane Austen t-shirt that has her authentic signature on it. Yes, I'm a nerd, but I'm an excited nerd. And I want to get started by giving you guys an introduction on Jane Austen and on Pride and Prejudice. So without further ado, let me show you guys what I prepared. So first of all, I do want to share with you that I chose this novel for a very particular reason. Let me clarify what that reason is, and just kind of like give you my logic behind using this novel for English 104. So English 104 is supposed to be the scholar's critical thinking journey, right? That's the whole purpose. It's supposed to be an introduction to logical flaws and to strong reasoning. And, this is a romance novel. So a lot of people, when they first hear Pride and Prejudice, they might automatically say, well, why would you give a romance novel? It's like kind of like assigning a romantic comedy as like a major work in a critical thinking class. So I am going to explain that. But before I do, I just want to give you guys a little bit of context on the novel without giving that much away. So this novel is about basically a girl who is in, I would call, let's simplify it. I would say that she's part of like the lower middle class, not necessarily working class, but her family lives a fairly comfortable life, though not too comfortable, and a man who happens to be extremely wealthy. And at a time period, and we're talking about the late 1700s to the early 1800s, it was very uncommon for people to marry outside of their social classes. And so the romance happens, in a sense, the love that forms between these two people, despite social differences, despite familial differences, even despite differences in character and personality. So that is going to be my general premise. I don't want to give away a whole lot because when you guys start reading, I really want you to enjoy the journey of the novel yourselves. But that's the essence of Pride and Prejudice. The reason I chose it for our class is actually a very good reason. So hear me out. I know a lot of the guys in the class are like, man, I gotta read a romance novel. What the hell? But let me just defend myself for a second and explain why I chose this novel. I chose this novel because it is depicting a critical thinking journey in the main character. And Elizabeth Bennet is our main character, and we get to see how she goes from really being a flawed thinker to one who achieves critical thinking by the end of the novel. Jane Austen loved to write about characters that were deeply flawed, that were inconsistent, that were often hypocritical, and we get to see that in a lot of her characters. So we're learning logical fallacies and all of that, and we get to see a lot of these fallacies in action while we are reading the novel. So that's my little intro of why I decided to choose this novel. Sorry. Now, I would like to give you guys a little bit of background on Jane Austen. So here's a little illustration of Jane Austen. Unfortunately, there is no photograph of her. So everything is kind of like, this picture is based on a sketch that her sister took of her. Her sister liked to dabble in drawing, and so her sister sketched her frame, and then that sketch has become the basis of Jane Austen's image. I know it's crazy. So we don't really know what she looked like, but this is kind of like a rough representation, I guess you could say. Now, Jane Austen was British. She was born in Steventon, England. I put her birthday here, December 16th, 1777. Fun fact, that date is marked in my calendar. Every year on December 16th, I get a notification that pops up that says, Happy birthday, Jane Austen! So, Yes, I did clarify that I'm very much a nerd. And I get very excited. And I'm like, and I toast to Jane Austen. Usually I have some wine and I'm like, happy birthday, Jane Austen. um, just a little bit of family information on Austen. So her father was a clergyman. He's actually, the title officially was called rector. Her mom and dad were part of the lesser gentry. So let me just explain what that means. The gentry was kind of like the middle class at that time period. The lesser gentry would sort of be like the lower middle class. I mean, they were comfortable. We couldn't say that they're poor, but definitely the family did need money. They weren't like super comfortable. Okay. And I did want to clarify that as my third bullet. I wanted to say that despite the fact that the Austen name was good and they had some good family connections, like they were related to some wealthy people, unfortunately, they were not rich. And I say unfortunately for a very specific reason. And that reason is at that time period, if you were not wealthy and you were a female, your best chance of living a comfortable life was to get married. That was just the reality. Now, here's a family tree that I would like to show you guys. This is the Austen family. Now, Jane Austen had 8 siblings. Yes, they did not believe in protection back then. And so there were 8 of them. And if you notice, there were only 2 girls in the entire family. Notice the portraits that are kind of like blocked out. They're phased. They're the siblings that did not live long. One brother actually went to war, so I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. She had one sister, an older sister, Cassandra, and she, probably her closest relationship was with Cassandra. So that's the Austen family. And then I also wanted to show you guys, oops, yeah. I also wanted to show you guys just a little bit of background on Jane Austen. So because I've read so much about her, and because my master's thesis was on Jane Austen, and I read some biographies. There was even her nephew who wrote a biography on Jane Austen. I've come to realize that a lot of Jane Austen's story in her personal life was told through her family members and through her loved ones. And one of the things that they mentioned about her was that she was very much a private person. She was a very reserved person. She wasn't like in the public eye a lot. She would write these stories to herself, mainly for herself and for her family members. So she was very much like a family oriented person. She had very strong family values. And oftentimes the Austen family would sit around and there would be Jane, the writer in the family, who would read her stories out loud to her parents and to her siblings. And Pride and Prejudice was their favorite story. So that's a cute little story. Just a little bit more about Pride and Prejudice that I did want to clarify for you guys. Sorry, let me just make this bigger. That I did want to clarify, okay, is that Pride and Prejudice was originally titled First Impressions. And I love that title too. I do see why she later changed it to Pride and Prejudice. But first impressions, that's what we usually get when we meet someone for the first time, right? And sometimes it's a negative first impression, sometimes it's a positive one. And the protagonists in the story, Elizabeth and Darcy, when they met each other, they had a lot of bias and they had a lot of prejudice. And so later on, Jane Austen decided that she's going to title her novel Pride and Prejudice, which was the 2 main flaws of the main characters. And I'm going to have you guys guess later on which one is pride and which one is prejudice. I think you'll realize it probably after volume 1. But just a little fun fact that even though the novel was written in the late 1700s in 1796, and it was written when Jane Austen was only 21 years old. That's about the age of some of you guys, right? Which is crazy. You know, it's such a young age, but at the same time, her talent was so immense that most of her novels were written while she was in her 20s. And then she revised it, and the novel, she published it in the 1800s. In 1813 was when the publication came out. Excuse me. So, another little fun fact I wanted to share with you guys as my intro. I was lucky enough to go to England, and that was part of, it was probably like my biggest dream growing up. I wanted to go to England and I wanted to visit Jane Austen's home, and I did. Right before the pandemic hit, I went along with my friends, my sister, my niece, and we went to this is Jane Austen's little cottage. It's called Chawton House, and then she lived in an extension of that house. It's kind of like a little back house, and it was called a cottage. You know, so most of her life she lived here, and this is where she wrote all of her novels. So when I went into this cottage, you guys cannot imagine how tiny it was. It was very small. We got to see Jane Austen's bedroom where she shared a bed with her sister. This is kind of like those single beds where like only one person fits. Well, she was fitting on that with two people. It was just crazy. Their kitchen didn't even look like a kitchen. It just sort of looked like a fireplace. Um, the laundry section, everything about the house was has been updated just because this is a museum now, and so people come all the time in order to visit Jane Austen's home. And the keepers of this place, they try to keep it as authentic as possible, so it's not like renovated or anything, but when you go in there you see what life must have been like in the early 1800s. And it was not easy, I gotta tell you. So I wanted to also share this. This is me all geeked up, yes, wearing the same t-shirt. And this is Jane Austen's writing desk. And this is where she sat down and wrote Pride and Prejudice. I mean, if that's not exciting, I don't know what is. I think it's a really tiny table. When I look at it and I compare it with my desk now, I'm like, wow, I have so much space to put all of my pages. Um, the fun fact I wanted to share with you, the at the museum, I learned that Jane Austen would sit in this room and she would know anytime somebody would be coming because the door would creak. So whenever the door would creak, she would put her writing away. She was very private about her writing until she was ready to share it. I can relate to that. Nobody really likes criticism of their writing, right? And Jane Austen had that like timidity and that shyness about her, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. And can we just also notice for a second that she was writing with a quill? Can you imagine writing like 300 pages with a quill where you're just like, dipping it in ink and then writing it? It would be a mess all over the place, but that was just the reality at that time. Moving on, just a little bit more about the novel and about Jane Austen's time period. I did mention that her brother had gone to war, and you're probably wondering, what war are we talking about? So during this time period, there was the French Revolution. And you're probably thinking, well, that was in France and this is England. What's the connection? There was actually a connection because the French Revolution impacted all of Europe. And initially, it started off with, the people rising up against the aristocracy in France, right? We know the king and queen were beheaded, and then, obviously this war began. And unfortunately, the French Revolution, it spread for so many years, and it went from this honorable notion of fighting for liberty and ending tyranny, and soon it became kind of like a reign of terror where anybody who was associated with the king or queen, or with aristocracy or with the nobility, a lot of times they were put to the guillotine. So it's not like this positive time period, especially for Jane Austen. And some of those themes where you notice that conflict between the classes, where you notice this constant struggle, this constant war between the upper class and the lower class, you're going to see those themes in Jane Austen's novels, all of them. But we see it a lot in Pride and Prejudice. I would also like to mention that Jane Austen's brothers had actively gone to these wars. And I say wars because it was a series of wars that were occurring at that time, and England was involved as well as France. And so were other European countries. But what's really strange, and this is something that a lot of critics have condemned and they've criticized about Jane Austen. What's really strange is that Jane Austen's novels, not a single one are about war. The themes of war and about the struggle between the classes are implemented in the novels, but war itself, like battles and deaths and so on, it's only mentioned in this like light and comical, light-hearted way. So this has received a lot of criticism from a lot of people, and it's one of the things that I researched when I was a student because I was fascinated by it. I was like, how can you be living during a time period when there is actively wars going on, outside of your household, and you don't really mention it in your novels? Your novels are about the drawing room and about, cup of tea, and let's go to this ball and let's go to that ball and let's find a man to marry and be comfortable. How is it possible not to mention war? And I think that had a lot to do with Jane Austen's style of writing, which I would like to, talk about as we continue on. I think I don't want to overwhelm you with too much information, but I do think that Jane Austen's style of writing was filled with subtlety. That's what she liked best. She liked subtle ways of addressing major conflicts. And so I guess you could say, it's like a way of avoiding the issue. But in a way, I don't think it was avoidance as much as it was a very clever use of irony in her style. Okay, next I would like to mention just a little bit about Jane Austen. And probably this is the most frustrating information that I will share with you guys. We know very little about her personal life, and that's very unfortunate. And it's because Jane Austen, like I mentioned before, was a private person, and we only know about her personal thoughts and feelings and what's going on in her personal life just from the letters that she wrote to her sister Cassandra. Unfortunately, after Jane Austen died, and she died very young, she died at the age of 42 years old. That's very young. And she died, not no one really knows what exactly she died of, but it seems to be, the speculation is some type of a cancer. Cassandra, her sister, decided to burn a bunch of her letters after her death. Why? Why did she do that? So a lot of Jane Austen fans and scholars are very upset with Cassandra for doing that. It seems like she robbed us of our chance to get to know Jane Austen, the great novelist. We were dying to know about her personal life, but unfortunately, Cassandra Austen felt like she wanted to protect Jane Austen's reputation. So maybe, the speculation is maybe if there were some letters that showed Jane in an unflattering way, she burned it. Or maybe some information that Jane wrote about was a little bit too open, like it was too much information about her personal life, and because Cassandra knew that her sister was very private, she decided to burn that. Who knows why she burned it? I'm very sad that she did, because we don't really know that much about her personal life. But whatever we do know is reflected through those letters and through the testimonials of her nieces and nephews, particularly her nephew, who wrote like a memoir, a little biography on her. We do know that for a very brief moment, she had an engagement. She said yes to a dude, and then she was like, never mind, I take it back. And so she decided that she does not want to get married, and she never did get married. You know, and at that time, it was very typical for women, young women, to get married in their early 20s. And she never did. She devoted her life to her family and to her writing. So this is the tombstone of Jane Austen. And I wanted to show you guys this, that she died on July 17th. So the anniversary of her death is actually coming up on July 17th. And it was, again, most likely cancer, although it's very hard to tell. And then on her tombstone, I absolutely love this. This is what it says: the benevolence of her heart, the sweetness of her temper, and the extraordinary endowments of her mind obtained the regard of all who knew her and the warmest love of her intimate connections. What a beautiful inscription on someone's tombstone. Basically, it captures what Jane Austen meant to the people around her. Because she was so private, because she was such a family-oriented person, her tombstone reflects that. You know, it reflects the fact that she was beloved by her family, and, you know, thought well of from anybody that essentially knew her. And I think that's very beautiful. So, going into the theme of Jane Austen's novels, I do want to say that there's this poem. Let me just like contextualize it for you guys really quickly. Masterpiece Theater decided to do like a Jane Austen collection where they made a bunch of movies from Jane Austen's novels. And then the promo of that, and I want to make sure the volume is good. So I'm not going to play this during my tutorial. I actually want you guys to pause my video and watch the promo because it's absolutely beautiful. You will hear this poem being read out loud and with the most beautiful music ever. So please take a moment and watch that video. The poem says, and I think it beautifully captures the theme of Jane Austen's novels. It says, there is an honesty behind a glance, a meaning behind a touch, and faith cried with a tear. There are lies behind a promise, importance in a whim, and deceit sealed with a kiss. There is hope behind a gesture, value in a token, and unspoken love delivered with a smile. This goes back to the subtlety that I was talking about, that Jane Austen's style of writing is so subtle, you almost have to read between the lines. And that process of reading between the lines is captured in the beauty of this poem. So please take a moment, if you have not done so already, press pause on my video, go ahead and watch that video. I think you will really enjoy the music and the lovely poem that was written that really captures the theme of Jane Austen's novels. All right, now I would like to talk about Pride and Prejudice, the novel that we are about to read. And speaking of the novel, this is the version that I have. This is the Norton edition of the novel that I use. This edition in the back has a bunch of essays attached. So if you guys would like a very good edition, I recommend this. This is the Norton that has like a collection of essays, and it actually has a bunch of letters that Jane Austen wrote to Cassandra, and it's published in the back of this book if you guys want to know. Now, Jane Austen, when she's writing this novel, you know, as any author would do, she develops a connection to her characters. And when she's writing about Elizabeth Bennet and she's writing this letter to her sister Cassandra, there's a moment in the letter that she says, I must confess that I think her as delightful a creature as ever appeared in print, and how I shall be able to tolerate those who do not like her, at least I do not know. Now, I think this is such a vulnerable moment, and it shows two things. It shows, first of all, Jane Austen's love for the characters that she created. And secondly, Jane Austen's fear of rejection from the audience that reads her novels. This is something that, every single author experiences, that fear of rejection, that fear that the public is not going to love the artwork that you are putting out there the way that you love it. And she does say, like, I love this character. If others don't love her the way that I love her, I'm going to be heartbroken. And I think that's such a beautiful and vulnerable moment to admit out loud. Now, about the novel itself, she also wrote to her sister and said, and she said it in this very comical way, the work is rather too light and bright and sparkling. It wants shade. It wants to be stretched out here and there with a long chapter about something unconnected with the story, an essay on writing, a critique on Walter Scott, or the history of Bonaparte, or anything that would form a contrast and bring the reader with increased delight to the playfulness and epigrammatism of the general style. So, in here, Jane Austen is trying to be funny. She's showing her sense of humor, but at the same time, she's also mocking a lot of the novels that were published during that time period. So we're talking about kind of like the early Victorian period. This is like the late Romantic period and the early Victorian period. And at that time, there were like these very serious novels being published, like Ivanhoe. And Ivanhoe was about knighthood and about battles and wars. And so she's like, my novel should have been like that. I should have put a chapter that just randomly was about, like something dark, something that had shade, and it would have been more like serious than what it is now. So she calls her novel light and bright and sparkling as sort of a criticism. But if you ask me, I think she takes pride in that. And Jane Austen, nowadays, whenever her books are being turned into films, we get to see that they're actually comedies a lot of the time. And it's because Jane Austen's style has a very comedic element in it. She's always being funny. Her irony is lighthearted. It's not to the point of sarcasm that tries to attack a person, tries to bite a person. It's very lighthearted comedy. Now, if you guys are interested, I wanted to give you a book that I recommend. I read this myself. I own it. It's by Carol Shields. It's this small book that's on Jane Austen's life. If anything that I've said, piqued your interest, then you might want to check it out and read this biography. Now, I also put over here a YouTube link that I would like you guys to press pause on my video and go ahead and watch the video. This is a trailer to Pride and Prejudice, and this is the 2005 Pride and Prejudice featuring Keira Knightley and Donald Sutherland. Now, I gave you guys this trailer because the version that I love, that I recommend, it doesn't really have a good trailer. It's too old. So as a movie trailer, if you guys want to get like the basic gist of the novel and what it's about, I recommend watching this. But if you would like to, after completing the novel, after you have read the novel, I do recommend that you watch the BBC 1995 version of Pride and Prejudice. That one is featuring Jennifer Ale and Colin Firth. Please watch that one. Now I have to warn you, it's not a fast watch. Watch it if you have like 5 hours to spare. It is kind of long. It's like a 5-part mini series. Each part is approximately 50 minutes. So it's going to take a while, but this version that I'm calling my favorite is probably the most accurate novel adaptation that I've ever seen in my life. I've never seen a novel being captured on the screen so well as this version. And that's why I recommend it. I always think that movies butcher the novels that they're trying to represent. Like, I don't know, Game of Thrones totally butchered the novels, even though the novels haven't technically ended. So many of them, even like Twilight and Bridgerton. There's so many that I think are my favorites, and I've just learned that I need to detach the novel and the movie because I'm always going to be disappointed in the movie version. Always. There's always something that they're leaving out. There's always something that they're misrepresenting. And I never feel happy about it. But this 1995 BBC version is the best. I recommend it very, very highly. So, especially if you're having trouble understanding the content, check it out. Now, I have a few slides that I prepared especially for you guys to clarify how you should be reading this novel. Now, I told you guys that social class was a major part of the novel. And so what I decided to do is I made a pyramid of the social ladder. And this is representing the social structure in the novel and the way that the people in the novel are categorized. So at the very top is the aristocracy. So these are like, this is called the landed gentry. These are the people who are rich. They're not newly rich, they're old rich. Their families were rich. They come from generational wealth. So their dads passed all of this wealth to their sons. And so, they're part of the aristocracy. We have the Darcy family. So Darcy has inherited an enormous estate called Pemberley from his father. And then underneath Darcy in the social ranking is his aunt, Lady Catherine. And Lady Catherine is an extremely wealthy widow. And, back in the days, obviously a widow, how could she be wealthy? Well, she had her own wealth to begin with. She was rich to begin with. And her husband, upon death, he left her this enormous estate, Rosings Park. And so when you're a wealthy widow, your life is pretty set. It's nice. And so Lady Catherine is right below the Darcys. Then comes, notice that this is technically under the aristocracy, but I put the Bingley family in its own category. Why did I do that? Why did I separate the Bingley family, who also happen to be very rich, from the Darcys and the Lady Catherine? Why did I do that? Well, because the Bingley family, it does not come from generational wealth. In fact, we learned early on in volume 1 that the Bingley family used to be in trade. They were down there, in the trade category, and they earned enough. The dad, Mr. Bingley's dad, earned so much wealth that he was able to buy an estate. So they're like hanging out with aristocrats, but they're not really aristocrats. They might have that title here and there, but they're not considered landed gentry. So that's why they're a little bit below. Now comes the gentry. Now the gentry is called the respectable class. They happen to be fairly comfortable. I guess we could call them the middle class. These are the people who do not have to work for a living because they also have estates that's passed to them from generation to generation. Like the Bennet family, Longbourn is Mr. Bennet's estate, and the Lucas family. Now, why are they lower in their ranking? Because even though they have an estate, even though they don't have to work for a living, and their land provides them with enough comfort to continue living, they just do not have the wealth. They don't. They're kind of like lower middle class. Like, they don't have enough wealth to be considered aristocrats. And then comes trade. And what's interesting is that this is the category of people who had to work for a living. And you're like, oh my gosh, how terrible. They had to work for a living? Yes. Back then, there was a stigma against that. if you had to work for a living, that just meant that, you didn't have a landed estate. You didn't have that generational wealth or that history behind your family name. And the people like the aristocrats would look down at the trade folk. Now, here's the irony that I would like to talk about very briefly. The Gardner family. Mr. Gardner is the brother of Mrs. Bennet, Elizabeth's mom. So Elizabeth's uncle is a lawyer. So he works for a living. He's part of the trade class. But Mr. Gardner is wealthier in terms of like money than the Bennets are or even the Lucases are. So even though he ranks at the lowest in the social scale, where like let's say aristocrats don't want to hang out with him because, he's nothing, he doesn't have like any title or anything. Mr. Gardner actually has more money, more wealth than some of the people in the gentry. Isn't that ironic that he would be considered lower, but yet be more financially stable than any one of them? The Bennets and the Lucases. So that is the most interesting part. The way that the social structure was really arranged and organized at that time period was very odd. And then we get the Phillips family, and they are even lower. And so I wanted to kind of like categorize all of the families in this social scale so that you guys could always look at this chart and figure out like, okay, who's who and where do they belong. Now, I'm going to post this because I think it might be helpful for you guys. Let me just lower this just a little bit. So here's a character chart that I found online, and I thought it might be helpful for you guys when you are reading the novel. The first time that I was reading the novel, I actually made my own character chart because I realized that it was kind of hard to follow along with the Mr. and the Mrs. and the Miss. There's a lot of titles. You might see like a Mrs. Bennet and then a Miss Bennet and a Jane Bennet, and you're like, oh my gosh, who are these people? So here's a chart. I don't know if that will help you. So feel free to use it. You can print it out and use it in accompaniment with the novel. Next, I also made one more chart that I think might be helpful. Where should I put myself? I'll put myself here. I made this chart on purpose. When I was doing my master's thesis, the title was really politics and Jane Austen, and I was looking specifically at the politics of Jane Austen. And in terms of political view, right? We have like the liberal and the conservative camps. The liberal is often associated with a future oriented, and this is a little bit more like not our liberals and conservatives. It's more like during Jane Austen's time, how they considered liberal minded versus conservative minded people. So liberal minded people, they were fairly emotional. They were guided by pathos, they were guided by their passions. They thought about the future. They were a little bit more like open-minded and willing to accept change. Conservative-minded people relied on logos, so they relied primarily on their reason and logic. They were very past-oriented people, and also one of the things about them was that they did not like change. So now I created this chart to categorize these individuals. The ones on the right tend to lean on the conservative side. The ones on the left tend to lean on the liberal side. What is Jane Austen's position on all this? Jane Austen believes that everyone needs to be right here in the middle. And that is what she's representing. She's representing the spectrum as being the two extremes that and when you look at the characters that are on either side of the extremes, like Lady Catherine on one side and Mrs. Bennet on the other side, you realize that these are deeply flawed characters. And that's because a person's character benefits from a combination of reason and emotion, from a combination of working towards the future and also respecting the past, a combination of, willing to accept change, but at the same time respecting your own history. And so Jane Austen's real message in this novel is that these characters, Elizabeth and Darcy, and a lot of the other characters in the novel, they're only going to benefit when they learn to come to the center, because the center is the good place to be. So I put my arrow on Elizabeth because she's the protagonist, but Elizabeth is supposed to represent the center leaning towards the left, while Mr. Darcy is supposed to represent the center leaning towards the right. And it is only they become fully complete as characters when they come together and the two sides meet. So I made this chart to help you guys out so that you guys could see in terms of Jane Austen's characterization and categorizing of how she views these characters in terms of liberal or conservative, how I would rank them according to her representation. Now, Jane Austen's irony. I talked about Jane Austen's overall style, and I think a good place to kind of wrap up is just to mention Jane Austen's irony. This is the main style of Jane Austen's writing. If you do not know what irony is, I really want you guys to look it up. And I think this is a nice little test to see if you understand irony and to see if you understand Jane Austen's irony. So the opening lines of Pride and Prejudice, this is the very first sentence of Pride and Prejudice. It reads, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife." That is the opening line of Pride and Prejudice. So my question is, what is the irony behind this statement? So what we know about irony is that irony is a contradiction between what is being written and what is truly being meant, right? It's a difference between what you say and what you mean. And it doesn't always have to be in speech. It could be in writing. It could be in drama and so on. So in this case, it's what Jane Austen is writing is not truly what she means. There's an underlying meaning behind these words. What is it? And I want to see if you guys are able to identify the irony. So here's a little challenge. For those of you who are interested in 5 extra credit points, I would like you to write me an email. By the end of this week, write me an email attempting to guess what Austen's irony is behind this first sentence of her novel. So try to explain it. I already know what it is because I've read this novel 5,000 times. So I just want to see if you guys get it. And you might earn from 1 to 5 extra credit points. Who knows? If you get it right, I will, give you a round of applause. And if you don't quite get the mark, I will, thank you wholeheartedly for trying. So if you guys are interested in those 5 extra credit points, feel free to email me. Take a guess. What do you think Jane Austen's irony is behind this statement? Now, last thing I do want to really quickly mention is that I put together a little glossary for you guys. I know that reading Jane Austen is not the easiest thing in the world. She's got this very conventional style of writing. I understand that. So as part of my introduction, I did want to create a list of words that I think you might need to know the definition of. So these are words that are mentioned just from volume 1 And then as we go along, I will introduce a little bit more of these glossary words that I think you need to know in order to better understand Jane Austen's society. So please, if you want to create like a study guide for yourself, if you want to just kind of like quiz yourself every now and then of what these words mean in Jane Austen's world in the context of her novel, then go ahead and use this slide for your benefit. All right, and that is my introduction of Jane Austen and Pride and Prejudice. I really hope you guys enjoyed it. Please feel free to ask me any questions. I cannot wait until you guys start reading this novel. Feel free to reach out to me and express your opinions. I would love to know what you think and feel about this novel. So enjoy.